In this section we'll check SELinux states, modes and types and see the importance of the config file. And we'll use some commands to demonstrate things. Now when SELinux is present on your system, it can be in one of two states, enabled or disabled. And for sure, when the state is enabled, it will be active, and when it's disabled, it will not be active. And when it's enabled, it can be in one of two modes, enforcing or permissive. This simply means that when it's enforcing, it will be actively allowing or denying access to the objects that it protects. And all its actions will be logged to var log audit.log. And when it's in permissive mode, it will still log to the audit log, but it will not block any actions. So this would be a mode that could help you to either troubleshoot some issues you might have without having to change to the disabled state, or maybe you want to make sure that there will not be any problems when you activate a newly configured machine. But keep in mind that your system is vulnerable when it's in permissive mode. So SELinux should be enabled at all times, but you can switch between enforcing and permissive if you like. And this can be done on the fly, as we will see, using the setenforce command. And when SELinux is disabled, it's simply disabled. So there's no mode to describe other than that it is disabled. And to change between the two states of disabled and enabled, you will have to reboot your system. So it's important to realize that when you disable it, all new files will not have a label. So if you enable it again, all these files will have to be labeled. So in short, it's simply not a good idea to disable SELinux. And the file that configures all of this is the config file in etc SELinux. Now let's first check that out before we talk about SELinux types. So I'm logged in as root, and first I list the contents of the config file. And I see that at boot time SELinux will be set to enforcing. And we see the possible modes just above that. And again we're going to have a look at these types in a second. Now to view the mode that SELinux is in at this moment, we can use the getenforce command, and it will tell us that it's enforcing. And if we want to change that, we can use setenforce 0, and then it will become permissive on the fly. So we don't have to reboot for that. And now we saw that when the mode is set to enforcing, it will deny access if needed. But when it's set to permissive, it should only log, but not actually deny. So let's just set our web server port to 8888 once more and do a test on that. This new port is not a trusted port in the HTTPD domain, but our web server is allowed to bind to the new port, since our web server is up and running and it's using port 8888. And to see if there would have been any problems if the mode would have been enforcing, we can use the SEAlert again to check any information about denials, and indeed this port is not a port in the HTTPD domain, so we should either change it back to port 80 again, or we should change the policy so that it will be in the correct domain. And one way of doing that is by using SEmanage, which will allow us to list current values and change them without having to recompile the policy. So we can manage ports, file context, modules and more. For now we'll just have a look at ports, because we need to allow HTTPD to bind to port 8888 even when the enforcing mode is active. Let's first run semanage port-l to list all current values. And that is an awful lot of information, so we need to filter a bit. So we use grep to filter out all lines that start with HTTP to get the information we need. And it lists the ports that HTTPD is allowed to connect to. And our port is not in there yet. So we will add our port to the HTTP port type with protocol TCP. And that's it. So we check it again, and now 8888 belongs to the HTTP port type. So we should be fine. To test that, we'll switch back to enforcing by using setenforce, and then we restart HTTPD. So this looks okay, and indeed our new port is no longer denied. Now there's one more thing we need to discuss with regards to enforcing and permissive modes. We saw that we can change between the two modes on the fly, but the thing is that we change the entire system from enforcing to permissive or from permissive to enforcing. So this goes for all domains. But what if we want to stay in the enforcing mode for all domains but only want to test the HTTPD domain by setting it to permissive? This is possible, so I mean you can keep your system secured except for one single domain, which you want to set to permissive mode. You can do that by using SEmanage again. So for example, to set the httpd_t to permissive, we run SELinux permissive-a httpd_t. This will only allow HTTPD to get started even though there is a problem. Of course the problem will be logged, but there will be no actual denial. And to reverse this, we run SELinux permissive-d httpd. So the A stands for add and the D stands for delete. Now we had a look at states and modes, but what about these types? We don't have to spend too long on that. The thing is that most implementations use the targeted mode. There's a very small percentage of organizations that use the multi-level security type, which is very complex because next to context types it also works with users and roles and levels. And when you start, there is no permission whatsoever, so everything has to be set up from scratch. And the minimum type is a stripped down version of the targeted type. And targeted simply means that only domains that are targeted by SELinux will be subject to security checks. So in general, network related services are targeted. So think of HTTPD, named, and some others. So again, we will concentrate on the targeted type because that is what you will most likely run into. And now to end this section, there is one very nice command that will give us some interesting information with regards to states and modes. And this is the SEStatus command. When we run it, it shows the following. The interesting fields for us right now are the status, which is enabled, the policy that's loaded, which is targeted. The current mode is enforcing, but we can change this to permissive using the setEnforce command. And the default mode at boot time would be enforcing, as it says in the config file. Now by means of a summary, next to the SEStatus command we discussed the getEnforce and setEnforce commands to query the current situation and change it on the fly from enforcing to permissive and back. We also used the SEManage command to change the context type, and the SEAlert command to find out about possible denials by SELinux. And in the next module we will have a look at labeling.